our own. ERGI's principles are integrated into the U.S. foreign policy and development assistance architecture. This may be most significant considering the newly launched Development Finance Corporation, or DFC. The DFC is a critical and powerful tool to leverage U.S. government financing to catalyze private sector capital in order to advance countries' development. In determining eligibility for capital, the DFC will now consider whether a country has embraced ERGI principles as a preferred criterion. In addition, we would like to engage with a broader group of countries to move beyond the sources of mineral supply to those that are the catalysts for demand growth. We need all parts of the supply chain to step up and embrace best practice. To do so, we are planning on hosting a series of workshops to discuss these very principles with the global extractives community. The ERGI founding partners are all mining leaders in their own right, but are committed to share our collective experience and learn from the broader global community. The cloud of COVID will eventually disperse, and we will get back on the road and sponsor workshops on the margins of major mining conferences, venues like the Intergovernmental Forum or the yearly Mining in Davos Conference. Ultimately, we would like to see ERGI and our broader efforts generally on critical minerals lead to helping countries attract best-in-class investment in the energy mineral sector. The United States is committed to this mission. ERGI establishes the tools. The U.S. can help countries implement these principles through technical and capacity building support on the ground. We look forward to developing partnerships with like-minded, well-intentioned countries and want the market to recognize those countries as preferred sources. This is a critical moment in the energy transition. Not only are we beginning to see the exponential increase in electric vehicle deployment, we're facing a dramatically different investment climate driven by the pandemic. Historically, when oil prices drop, the corresponding enthusiasm for alternatives drop as well. However, it seems that this precedent may have been broken. For example, we've seen automotive companies double down on their electric futures, and some countries that plan to use recovery from the pandemic as a catalyst for further electricity expansion. The mining sector necessarily must expand to meet this demand. We must ensure that development is done responsibly, respecting human rights, labor, and environmental standards. The market is beginning to consider these fundamental considerations. We must collectively ensure that emerging nations are partners in development and not simply targets for predatory investment. Wealthy countries, financiers, and global stakeholders must consider the provenance of the mineral supply chains that enable their clean policies. Together, let's call for responsible practices and for the market to prioritize responsible sourcing. Thank you for this opportunity to speak a little bit with you today. I'll leave it for now. I'm very excited to hear from the other speakers and see how the rest of the day unfolds. This is a great beginning. Thank you very much, IRENA.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Fannon, for those remarks and for framing our conversation so well in your opening speech. Our program calls for us to now hear from the Director General of IRENA, Francesco Lacamera, but we've been notified that he's having a little bit of trouble logging in. Instead, we will hear from Morgan Bazilian first, from Professor Bazilian, and then afterwards turn to Director General Lacamera. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Morgan Bazilian, who is the director of the Payne Institute and a professor of public policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Previously, he was the lead energy specialist at the World Bank. He has over 2 decades of experience in the energy sector and is regarded as a leading expert in international affairs, policy, and investment. Dr. Bazilian is one of the foremost thought leaders in minerals governance and policy. Morgan, thank you so much for joining us today, and we greatly look forward to your remarks. Morgan, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Thanks for and inviting me to speak on minerals needed for the clean energy technology future. My name is Morgan Bazilian. I'm a professor and director of the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. The School of Mines is a public research university where students and faculty together address the great challenges facing society, particularly those related to the earth, energy, and environment. As we've heard, minerals and metals are central to the energy transition, but the economic, security, and geostrategic implications remain in play. And that's why it's so important to have organizations like the Department of State in the United States and IRENA participating in these conversations. We can be fairly confident that the tremendous growth and innovation in technologies such as batteries for electric vehicles and grid electricity storage, fuel cells, wind turbines, and photovoltaics will continue. And each of these technologies requires a significant quantity of diverse group of critical minerals and metals. Could I have the next slide, please? And one more. Thank you. The future energy system will be, back one. The future energy system will be far more mineral and metal intensive than it is today. Many of those advanced technologies require minerals and metals with particular properties that have few or no substitutes. At the same time, the opportunity for the mining industry itself is tremendous. An industry that has experienced enormous public pressure and critique, accompanied by offshoring production overseas, can now evolve into one fundamental to supporting a shift to low carbon and sustainable energy system. The issues related to the mineral foundations of the energy transition go well beyond energy and extractive sectors, and this is important to keep in mind. There's implications for geopolitics, for defense, for consumers, for water, for industrial growth, for innovation, for decent work and equality. The figure in front of you helps us better understand the historic development of the energy system, both energy sources and end uses. Society moved from agrarian communities using biomass to the Industrial Revolution and coal to a modern area of services and portfolio, including petroleum, gas, nuclear, and renewables. The current set of minerals required for clean energy technologies is diverse and increasing, and each of these minerals have their own set of supply chain conditions, markets, and will thus require individual examination and policy prescriptions. Next slide, please. At the same time, we know that the challenge of climate change is hugely significant, and on the left part of this curve in the red is the increase in historical CO2 emissions. The right part in blue are the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, set of future scenarios to bring the world to a 1.5 degrees C of warming above pre-industrial levels. Many of you have seen these curves. The difficult part is how you switch from something that goes upward to something that goes in the exact opposite direction, and we don't have much experience in this in the energy sector. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, each of these different, and this is not a comprehensive list on this graph, each of these different raw materials that become processed mineral materials and then components, products, technologies, etc., have different set of market conditions, different set of origins, different set of processing, and as a result, describing them as a homogeneous group does not work for policy or for diplomacy. Next slide, please. So at the same time, it's very difficult to predict the future. As we've seen, not many of us would have predicted we'd been sitting in our homes doing this presentation. My former employer, the World Bank, undertook important work and continues to do that in analyzing mineral intensity of future energy portfolios with a focus on clean energy. And as Assistant Secretary Fannon noted, the work shows enormous demand growth estimates for certain minerals, lithium, cobalt, graphite, vanadium, etc. At the same time, it's very difficult to understand what the scenarios of the technology innovation will look like, and they will in themselves impact. What we have here is just different estimates of what kind of battery technologies might, battery chemistries might look like over the next couple of decades. Next slide, please. The type of scenario described helps us better consider the effects of different policy responses, and while there may be some bottlenecks to supply along with price implications for markets, the resource basis itself on a geological basis for most of these minerals is large and unlikely to be a constraint. So in May 2018, the Department of the Interior in the United States produced a draft list of 35 critical minerals. Many of those are essential not only for energy, but for defense or aerospace sectors. But of course, the United States is not the only country or region to consider mineral criticality. Japan, the European Union, Australia have all produced critical minerals lists. The European Commission list started in 2011 and has already been updated 3 times since. Terrific work coming out of the USGS is shown on this slide in a heat map of the various commodities and their supply risk. So the focus in these exercises has been on supply risk, and that's how, for the most part, supply risk and import dependence are how minerals are deemed critical. Next slide, please. And you can see the list of critical minerals here, and in the United States, Senator Murkowski has been leading a lot of the work on that as far as domestic policy. Next slide, please. And here you see the other countries. This is Australia's table. The United States has 35, the European listed 27, and the Japanese report listed 31 critical minerals. These are dependent on national priorities. And so as an example, the Australian list is very different from the other lists I've mentioned here, as it's primarily focused on export, not as a security issue, but as an export and economic opportunity. Next slide, please. As is well known, China has become the dominant world player in many critical mineral supply chains. And what you can see in this graph is the importance of looking across the supply chain from the rock or from the lithium feedstock, in this case, through the chemicals, through cathodes, batteries, and electric vehicles. China has taken an interest all along that value chain. And in many cases, as you move along the value chain, the value add to the economy gets greater and greater. So you can see how their progress over time has changed, but a focus on the further sections of the supply chain. So understanding only a mining perspective on this is obviously insufficient. Next slide, please. And as Secretary Fannon described, there are issues of conflict and issues of economic development closely interconnected with the development of mining industries across the world. There are now filters you can use to show the different minerals and the countries where they're available, and then their level of, say, global governance based on world governance indicators or their level of conflict or fragility, et cetera. This has mostly been taken up, as most of the people on the call know, in relation to cobalt, but there are many other of these critical minerals that have deep implications for societies in fragile or conflict states, or that hold a large percentage of their GDP from mining. Next slide, please. So efforts by the Department of Energy in the US in creating what's called the Critical Materials Institute, CMI. It was originally created after the 2010 price spikes for rare earths. It remains an essential aspect for US technological innovation and advantage. We are working closely with the CMI. Part of the CMI is hosted at the Colorado School of Mines, and we're working right now on various scenarios for the future. Next slide, please. And as I noted previously, one has to look at the supply chains across supply chains, and it's a very complex picture when you start to look at the reporting structures for mining companies or for product companies about how these things move around the world and how their emissions are reported or how the security is reported, et cetera. Next slide, please. The future will likely bring more globally independent markets and systems, not less. As a result, it's useful to further encourage new quantitative and qualitative approaches to the issues of security and criticality, both minerals and energies. There's several analogies between mineral criticality and energy security, and they range from social license to operate to metrics of security of supply that should not just be on the supply side, but also the demand side. There are public and private elements to these industries. The importance of developing economies and emerging economies cannot be understated in either sector, minerals or energy security. We need to think across many different supply chains, which makes this very difficult. Each supply chain has several uncertainties. Each has a very different market profile, and I use quotes in market because some of them are not markets as we recognize them. But again, this is deeply interconnected, not independent. Finally, as a professor at one of the finest technical universities in the world on these topics, I can confirm that educational training and workforce development should be foundational elements of a domestic plan or international plan. I'm deeply honored to be speaking at this event today. Thank you to the State Department. Thank you to IRENA. And just to note that I believe this is the first meeting, a joint hosted meeting between organizations, and privileged to be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bazilian, for your remarks and such a comprehensive overview. It's always a pleasure listening to your explanations of these extremely complex topics, as you make such very difficult concepts very easy to understand for all of us. So I really appreciate that. We'd like to now introduce the Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, Director General Francesco Lacamera. In his role, DG Lacamera is responsible for leading the delivery of IRENA's work program and strategy in cooperation with the agency's member states. The Director General is tasked with redefining the structure and operations of the agency in response to the urgent needs of its members at this critical time in the energy transition. Director General Lacamera, many thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate your presence, and we look forward to hearing your remarks. Director General, could you please make sure that you are unmuted at this time?
I hope so. Can you hear, Mark?
Yes, now we can all hear you. Thank you so much.
That's good, Marco. I can say in Italian, grazie Marco, for your kind introduction. I am delighted that IRENA and the U.S. State Department have jointly organized this discussion on this critical of mineral for the global energy transition. This is a topic of growing importance, which has not yet received sufficient attention. My thanks to my friend, Assistant Secretary Fannon, and I wish to congratulate him and his team for the establishment of the Energy Resource Governance Initiative and their work to increase collaboration on this topic. I also wish to thank the US for their active participation in IRENA works on geopolitics of energy transformation and input you provide for the next phase of this work. We will convene a virtual meeting in a couple of weeks with our global membership to discuss the next steps on geopolitics. To provide context for our discussion, let me briefly speak about the global energy transition and the role renewable energy within it. From that, we will get a better understanding of why the supply of minerals, particularly those used for renewables and supporting technologies, are growing in importance. Today's discussion comes at a time of a great uncertainty. The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated many people's lives and is continuing to disrupt economies. This crisis has shown many of the vulnerability of the current economic system. As we start to rebuild, there are compelling reasons for recovering measures to prioritize energy transitions. At the beginning of this crisis, I spoke about the resilience of the renewable sector and predicted a strong performance. What unfolded over the last month confirmed these predictions and made a strong case for building a more resilient system. Importantly, the same action can help tackle the economic downturn through targeted investment and new jobs. In April this year, we launched as IRENA the first global renewable outlook, which outline a pathway to this future. We can go to the next slide. What we have presented in the global renewable energy outlook are two main scenarios that we have confronted with the actual scenario. One giving a 70% reduction in CO2 emission in 2050, and one for a decarbonization of the system, which means zero emission in the period from 2050 to 2060. But before to get there, I want to see how historically the renewable energy has shown the progress year by year. In the graph, you can see the installed capacity in the last 20 years. As you can see, renewable in the orange line has been more and more outpacing in the last 8 years the installed capacity of the traditional plants. Last year, 72%, 3/4 of the installed capacity came from renewables. And now more than 35% of all installed capacity globally come from renewables. But why this going to happen? It's not going to happen by chance. And remember that 10 years ago, no one was going to predict such evolution. The fact that this path has been based on some political policy measures in the starting though of the last decade, but now is mainly coming from the market. So we can move to the next slide on this. Please, next slide. Here you can see different way, in the yellow, the PV, in the yellow-orange, the concentrated solar power, on green, the offshore wind, and on blue, the onshore wind, sorry, in green, and on blue, the offshore winds. As you can see, all the technologies, newer technologies, fall in the average cost of the traditional plants. But what's happening now is that, especially if you look at solar and onshore winds, we notice as they are more convenient than any other cheapest chance with the traditional plants. Just today, we have launched the new cost report. And it is impressive to notice that if we consider the most costly 500 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity with solar and wind, if we're going to substitute the more costly 500 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity with solar and wind, we will get a saving of $23 billion per year. This means that we can help a stimulus package of $940. billion, sorry. Just to put differently, we can say that next year, 1,200 gigawatts of the standing coal capacity could cost more to operate than get the same energy from new renewable plants. So it's really the market that is leading this unbelievable progress. But now we go on the basis of this to have a look at what could happen in terms of CO2 reduction in our scenario. So we can go to the next slide. And on the orange line, we can see the baseline energy scenario from now to 2050. In the dark yellow one, what may happen with what already a government has committed in terms of energy, in terms of energy policies. But if you want to get a reduction, decarbonization of our system that could stay in line with the need to take control of the increasing of the temperature, we can say that going for the 70% of reduction of emission can get through the use of renewables and energy efficiency and with some switch of fuel. So it's very important to notice how relevant will be renewable in guiding us in a more sustainable path. This means that overall, the renewable share in primary energy supply will rise from around 14% in 2017 to around 75% in 2050. And the report showed that it's feasible. And this will be not only good because we will stay in line with the objective to decarbonize our economy, but it's also good for some other reason. And we can have a look in the next slide, the impact of going to this, following this scenario in terms of jobs creation. And we can see that we are now at around 11 million jobs just in renewables. But if you go along the path that we have designed, we go that in 2050 to have 4 times this number, so 42 million of jobs just in renewables, strictly in renewables. And if we also consider energy efficiency, we get another 21 million jobs. And if we go to the power grid and energy flexibility, in the orange section that you see in your slide, you see that we can get another 15 million jobs. So it's evident that the energy transition is not just good because we have to stay in line with the Paris Agreement. It's good because it's convenient, because it's creating jobs. Just to give a number, if I can. Naturally, this will not happen by miracle. We need investment. We estimate for a path to 70% of CO2 emission, we need, respect to what is already committed by governments, another 15 trillion US dollar of investment from now to 2050. But what we notice, if we consider also the externality, for any dollars that we spend in this energy transition, we'll get back from $4 to $8 for every dollar spent. So what does it mean? We are creating jobs with this investment, but we are also creating money back. And if you want to pass from the microeconomic analysis to the macroeconomic, we will see that we will get, and we go to the next slide, please, we'll get how going for this path will bring an advantage in terms of GDP of 2.5%. So going to the energy transition, going for more renewables will bring us to stay in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, going for the decarbonization of our system and getting an energy system that is clean, but it will give back also more jobs and they will give more revenue to us. And this brings to discussion of of today. And excuse me for this long introduction, but I wish to frame the discussion we are in today. And we go to the next slide, where we see the front of our last report as IRENA, the geopolitics of energy transformation. And this report has been very well received, and has been finalized just last year. It was set at the time a special global commission on geopolitics of energy transformation in the context of the IRENA work. And this work has outlined many opportunities, but also pointed out of some risks. The report emphasizes the country must prepare for the change ahead. One also that we have not forget conclusion of that report was the problem of access to energy, where we have going to launch on the 4th of June our new report on tracking SDG report, a report that we have drafted in collaboration with UNDESA, IA, with the World Bank. And this year reports find that the number of people worldwide lacking access to electricity has declined from 1.2 billion in 2010 to around 800 billion in 2018. But it is not enough. We have still more than 620 million people that lack access of energy. It is important to consider that these people need the support of all of us to get out of their emergency. And we have also to take into consideration risks that come from the growing global dependency on key minerals that we are discussing today. Indeed, our report drew on the work of our speaker, Dr. Bazilian, and reference the work of several of our panelists today, I'm sure. Countries will need a range of strategies to ensure sustainable supply. I am pleased this workshop is covering two facets of such strategies, both of which need to be pursued with great urgency. Firstly, I'm so sorry that I was not able to assist to the intervention of my friend Fannon, but I'm sure that he described the key approaches to expand and diversify resource supplies needed, but to do so in a way that is socially and environmentally responsible. This dimension will be explored in our first panel. Secondly, work to increase supply needs to go hand in hand with effort to reduce demand for new resources. We can do either through recycling and reuse of critical minerals in the context of circular economy, or through alternatives technology design that are less reliant on those minerals. This approach will be explored in our second panel. So I'm looking forward to hearing this discussion, and this will inspire, I'm sure, the work that IRENA is going to conduct in the next phases of geopolitical work. Thank you very much for your attention to all of you.
Thank you so much, Director General Lacamera, for all of your remarks and your analysis of IRENA's work. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for your speech. At this time, we will have a brief intermission of about 5 minutes before we reconvene for our first panel on governance. At this time, your screens may go blank, or you will simply hear no sound, and we will reconvene again for the first panel in 5 minutes' time. Thank you so much for your patience. Okay, welcome back to our audience. Welcome back to our audience. Thank you so much for your patience during our technical break as we assembled our panelists. I'd like to now introduce the moderator of our first panel on governance, Jenna Schroeder. Jenna Schroeder is a Global Energy Programs Officer here at the State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. And in addition to being a wonderful colleague, she is an expert in technical assistance and critical minerals generally. So with that, I'll ask Jenna to please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. As Mark said, my name is Jenna Schroeder, and I'm a Global Energy Programs Manager here at the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State. It's my pleasure today to moderate a panel on mineral sector governance. I think everyone speaking today understands the vital importance of this concept. Good sector governance can make or break whether or not a government can attract sustainable investment and also has significant implications for the overall reputation of the sector. Given the need for increasing amounts of energy minerals in the coming decades, as we've heard, I'm excited to hear today from some of the leaders working through these issues. Joining me today are three distinguished panelists. First, Peruvian Vice Minister of Mines, Augusto Cauty. Dr. Cauty has extensive experience as a lawyer and executive at law firms and companies, both in the public and private sectors in Peru, the U.S., and the APEC region. Previously, he served as general counsel in a subsidiary of a multinational mining company with operations in Latin America. In his current role, he is responsible for national policies promoting the sustainable development of Peru's mining sector. Next, we'll hear from the head of sector projects and responsible investment at the OECD, Tyler Gillard. Tyler is the head of sector projects and a legal advisor in the Responsible Business Conduct Unit of the OECD's Investment Division. He leads the OECD's work on due diligence in the financial, textiles, mining and metals, oil and gas, and agricultural sectors. Mr. Gillard joined the OECD in 2009 to lead the multi-stakeholder negotiation for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected areas, and has since overseen the development of numerous government-backed sectoral due diligence standards. And
Hello,
finally,
Mark. How are you? I'm here. Could you see me? No.
hello, Dr. Cauty. How are you? Yes, I can hear you. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Shawn Tupper, Associate Deputy Minister for Natural Resources Canada. Shawn was appointed Associate Deputy Minister in November 2018. Previous to this, he served as the Assistant
Let me check. 1 minute. Okay, let me check.
At the Privy Council Office, where he was responsible for economic and regional development policy, and also as the Assistant Deputy Minister for Policy at Transport Canada, where he was responsible for policy development for Canada's transportation systems. Welcome to each of you. We're so excited to hear your thoughts this morning. Before we move into the moderated portion, I wanted to give an opportunity for each of our panelists to share their views on mining sector governance. I think I'd like to turn to you first, Mr. Tupper.
Thank you. And thanks to our hosts at the State Department and IRENA for this opportunity to participate in today's session. It is a little odd to be sitting here alone in my basement, kind of talking to the world, but we do what we have to do these days. Greetings from Ottawa. I want to begin by recognizing that, while we are meeting virtually, I sit here today on the traditional lands of the Algonquin people. And this is a traditional acknowledgement that we make in Canada, that recognizes the important relationship of our federal government to our Indigenous population here. But I think it's equally important to do on a panel as we are here today talking about mining, and mining has such a huge impact on Indigenous people around the world. And I think it is an aspect to investigate. Mining matters for Canada, and our minerals and metals bring important benefits to Canadians. Canada, as you all know, is one of the largest mining nations in the world. We produce more than 60 minerals and metals, including sought-after metals such as lithium, cobalt, graphite, and nickel. All of those are required for our new economy for permanent magnets, electric vehicles, planes, solar panels, wind turbines, electronics, and lighter and higher strength metal alloys. Canada is ready to develop an integrated supply chain with its partners for both raw materials and value-added products. And the global presence of Canadian firms in this sector is sizable. In 2018, nearly 700 Canadian firms had assets valued at $174 billion in more than 100 foreign countries. We are home to almost half of the world's publicly listed mining and exploration companies, and many of these companies are active not only within Canada but abroad. The burden of that success for Canada is why I've been glad to get to know Frank Fannon over the past 18 months and to work with him and others to participate in this panel and to speak about governance issues. Together with non-governmental organizations, industry, civil society, governments have an important role to ensure supply chains integrate environmental, social, and economic considerations. Canada is a leader in exploration and mining-related research and development. We have a clear rules-based and predictable regulatory environment with innovative clean technology solutions and strong management practices that operationalize our mine sites. Canada's reputation for good governance and sustainable mineral development practices is a competitive advantage. Other countries look to Canada and Canadian companies for the way we build relationships with Indigenous people, build partnerships with communities, and protect the environment. Canada is also a leader in exploration and mining-related research and development. We have a clear, rules-based, and predictable regulatory environment with innovative clean technology solutions and strong, I'm repeating myself, sorry, and strong management practice. Last year, at the annual Prospector and Developers Association of Canada Convention, PDAC, Canada launched the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan, a roadmap that will see Canada realize our vision as the leading exploration and mining nation. The plan will help ensure that Canada has an even more competitive, sustainable, and responsible minerals and metals sector at home and abroad. At this year's PDAC, we introduced a pan-Canadian initiative to advance the implementation of that plan. This action plan highlights the steps we've recently taken and will continue to take to push Canadian mining to new heights. Earlier this year, we finalized a joint action plan on critical minerals collaboration with the United States to advance our mutual interests in securing supply chains needed for important manufacturing sectors, including communication technology, aerospace and defense, and clean technology. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the urgent need to secure global supply chains in strategic industries like clean technology, and recent reports by the International Energy Agency and the World Bank have highlighted the importance of minerals in a sustainable energy future. As value chains get stretched and tested during this crisis, and as our key partners express concerns with securing the steady supply of critical minerals, the importance of this work grows. This context is what has driven our country to be active internationally through bilateral relations with our partners and through multilateral fora where we promote and enhance natural resource governance. In Canada, we have taken corporate social responsibility to the next level. Canada is a leader in responsible business practice globally, and while there has always been room to improve practices, Canadian industry is leading the way. The Mining Association of Canada's Towards Sustainable Mining framework, which has been adopted as a standard of choice in a number of partner jurisdictions worldwide, is a demonstration of this commitment. Canada established and remains a key member of the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals and Metals and Sustainable Development, which works with governments around the world to advance their ability to effectively manage the sustainable development of these mineral resources. The Government of Canada has a long history of working to increase transparency in the extractive sector and to ensure that mineral resource-rich countries have the capacity to manage natural resources in line with UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Energy Resource Governance Initiative, or ERGI, is a natural next step and complements our existing work and our vision for the future of Canada's minerals and metals sector. As one of the founding partners, Canada has contributed to the ERGI online toolkit, an open and accessible platform for sharing knowledge and best practice in the mining sector. The toolkit allows governments and other stakeholders to learn from the founding partners' case studies on subjects ranging from geological surveying to social license to operate. Our partnership in ERGI will build on, pardon me, on the strong existing partnership we have with the U.S. and other fora like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights Initiative, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank you for this opportunity to share Canada's vision for advancing responsible and sustainable exploration and mining and our actions to build secure and resilient supply chains. I look forward to further discussing the connection between good governance and building critical mineral supply chains to support the energy transition. Thanks very much.
Jenna, we can't hear you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Tupper. That was great. Next, we'd like to hear from Mr. Tyler Gillard at the OECD. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Thank you, IRENA. Thank you as well to the U.S. government for inviting me to speak on this important topic of critical minerals and the energy transition. So why am I here? I work for the OECD, organization of 37 countries of mature economies, and we have global standards on responsible sourcing of minerals and metals to ensure they are responsible in driving development. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the broader set of human rights, social, and governance risks that you see in particularly battery metal supply chains. And then I'll talk a little bit about the trends we're seeing in governance from markets, but also from different governments around the world. So I think it's fair to say that when thinking about criticality of minerals, and this was highlighted by all the previous speakers already, and thinking about security of supply, resilience and responsibility really go hand in hand. And I think that's made even more clear by this crisis, where you see investors dumping money into ESG funds. Our data shows that actually ESG funds have doubled in the last 2 months, added, as much in the last 2 months as they had in the previous 12 months. So investors really see responsibility, like how companies engage with the workers, how well companies know their supply chains, and how they partner with the supply chains as markers of long-term performance and resilience, even in times like this, and particularly in times like this. We have done some work to look at the number of reports over the last 3 years on critical materials. We looked at reports of risk of human rights, social, and environmental risk associated with 38 different materials over the last 2 years. And I just want to give you a little bit of a flavor. So out of the 3 top battery materials, that's cobalt, lithium, and nickel, the overwhelming majority of the reports that have been coming out in the last 2 years have been focused on worst forms of child labor. That's close to 200 reports that have been reported in just 2 years, focused on the worst forms of child labor, predominantly with cobalt. Second biggest risk that has been reported over the last 3 years is bribery and corruption with the top battery materials. Again, cobalt comes as the top metal that has been reported for risk, but here you also see reports of lithium and nickel in various jurisdictions. Other risks that we have been seeing reported are risks of forced and compulsory labor. We've also seen major risks of direct or indirect support to non-state armed groups and sanctioned entities. So what does this tell us? Well, I think it tells us a few things. First of all, media reports are not the only source of risk. It's important to say. Media, civil society reports. There has been a lot of focus. Around 90% of the risk reports we've seen in the last years have focused on child labor and cobalt. But our own research tells us that, in fact, when we're looking on the ground, that sometimes a singular focus on child labor risks sometimes obscures pretty severe things like grand corruption that might be existing and the engagement of public and private security forces in the sector. It also tells us that there's a lot of attention right now on artisanal small-scale mining for perhaps good reason. Artisanal small-scale mining is often informal and thus often very vulnerable to abuse from criminal actors and is not generally enforced by environmental or labor law. But it's important to know that artisanal and small-scale mining is also the largest source of jobs in this sector. Roughly 85% of the mining workforce comes from the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. So it's also a real opportunity. They're also a major swing producer for most of the critical materials that you've seen. If you look at cobalt specifically, they produce roughly 20% of cobalt produced annually, 30% of Congolese cobalt. Congo is obviously the largest cobalt producer in the world. And ASM production played a critical role in 2018 and 2019 in helping to stabilize prices. So ASM is both a critical swing producer and a massive employer, but also highly risky, which creates major dilemmas for companies looking in the supply chains. So in the last minutes, let me talk a little bit about the trend that we are seeing in the governance around supply chains and battery materials. And particularly, I'm going to be looking at it from a market and supply chain angle. So undoubtedly, we know that risk associated with metal production, child labor, corruption, bribery, sanctions violations, terrorist involvement, create multiplicity of risks for business and users of those metals. That creates legal risks, it creates reputational risks for companies, it even creates market risk. So we've seen a whole patchwork of laws emerge on specific minerals for specific topics. So for materials like tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, in 30 of the 37 member states of the OECD, you have binding legislation requiring due diligence in those supply chains. So any importer of those products or minerals is required to differing degrees and extents, of course, to do due diligence on those minerals in line with OECD standards. But you also have thematic legislation emerging that's not focused on minerals per se, but really focused on issues like modern slavery. So you have modern slavery prohibitions and legislation in the UK, in the United States, in Australia, and even in the United States itself, under the US Tariff Act, Customs and Borders Control can in fact seize goods made wholly or in part with child labor. Cobalt has been notified as one of the high-risk materials for child labor production by the US government. So you're seeing a raft of patchwork legislation on themes and on specific minerals. But importantly, you're also seeing market makers, notably metal exchanges, taking major action to adopt requirements on responsible sourcing and due diligence for their markets. The most notable example is the announcement by the London Metal Exchange made last October that any LME brand, so any producer that would like to deliver metal into the LME, will be required to undergo an OECD guidance alignment audit in order to be deemed compliant and participate in that market. We also see requirements by banks, where banks increasingly expect their counterparties in commodity trade and commodity production to undergo audits against their sourcing to ensure that their sources are supporting development and not things like child labor, bribery, corruption, and risk. And we also see a whole raft of private sector schemes. Some have been mentioned already by Mr. Tupper, TSM from the Mining Association of Canada, but also ICMM. Also specific metal regimes have various private sector-led auditing schemes, which is fantastic, and that's a massive increase. One area that we're working in, and an area that government should really take note of, is how do we strengthen these schemes and harmonize them and push them towards convergence rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So legislation may be good and is perhaps needed, but they should build off of these very good efforts, and they should use and make sure that those efforts are aligned with international benchmarks. I could probably go on, but I'll save it for the Q&A because I know you're running behind time, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And to just close us out, Vice Minister Kauti will be joining us by phone, so there'll be no video. Vice Minister Kauti, are you available to give some remarks?
Yes. Well, good morning to everybody. Gina, thank you for the invitation to be participant of this panel. And actually, also thank you for the previous speakers that just listened to them on this very, very interesting topic, actually, not only because of what the mining sector in this particular case can provide to Peru, but also because of the reasons that worldwide we are now discussing in this panel. I don't know if do you listen okay, Gina? Is fine?
It's fine, yes.
Okay. Well, actually, I have to start saying what's the importance of the mining industry in Peru, which not only represents what we have on the way from the geological potential of our country, but also in terms of the competitiveness that the sector has in Peru, and that is part of not only the operating cost that we have here, but also, and very important, because of the human talent and expertise that we have in the country with the mining sector, which is an activity that runs for hundreds of years in Peru. And this actual leadership of Peru in the mining sector is demonstrated in certain facts that we are actually that we have in the worldwide scenario. Peru is the second largest copper, silver, and zinc producer, and the country has also the largest silver reserves in the world, and we are the largest gold, zinc, lead, and molybdenum reserves in Latin America. So in general, that puts the mining industry in a certain position of our economy to not only contribute to the development of our people, of our population, but also the outlook that we seen of the mining sector, not only for the country but also worldwide, remains promising for the coming years. And we still believe that there are great opportunities for investors and for a better benefit of our population, starting from the mining sector as a result of the development of more projects that we have here. In the past year, actually, in 2019, we have executed in the country more than $6,000 million in terms of monies executed in the mining sector, which has accounted for 3 years of growing of our sector in Peru. The exportations of the mining sector represents 60% of what the country exports to the world, almost $30,000 million in terms of the mining sector, and a GDP that equivalent to 10% of the national total is represented by the mining sector. And in this, actually, is what we are now focused for the future. No, we are working on initiatives that are planned to develop further what is the providers of the sector to grow with the technological input on the. We are developing a technological route with the mining sector and the production or industry ministry, which we are both working on this for the coming future. Actually, we're going to launch these days this initiative, and the idea is to grow with the provider chain and technological related to the mining sector, in order to have a more value-added input to this chain in favor of the country. We are also, as a government, supporting a mining cluster that is being created in the southern part of Peru, particularly in Arequipa, and this is being done with the support of the Andean Bank, the CAF. And we also support this, in general, these two initiatives, which are part of having a better support of all the technological providers in the sector and try to get the better and most of the mining sector in favor of our country. Last, also, just to finalize in this first introduction, I want to just make a point on what we are facing now with this COVID situation. Actually, the pandemic has, as any other countries, has really take us in a very it was a surprise moment for our country when we have these first cases at the beginning of March. So we have to decide to just keep mining operations and doing critical activities within the first 45 days of this situation. After, in May, we have taken the decision as a government to start with the reactivation of the mining sector. We start with the large miners, which are the ones that started in May. We are now launching the second restart of the mining sector with the medium-scale miners, and we are also working with the regional governments on transferring capabilities to the small and artisanal miners in order for them to be ready to start also as from June in the future. It's not going to be easy this year. We know we have a lot of challenges, and we have a quite responsible way to affront this particular future, and that's why we are also in this idea to work more with the responsibility of the mining sector. I think in these times that we are facing also an economic challenge for the country has invested almost 17% of the equivalent GDP in terms of supporting the reactivation of the economy and supporting people in a more vulnerable stage of their lives. And with this, we have a more responsible way to affront this from the mining sector. We have to work more on these governance issues in terms of having the most of the responsible for, especially we are asking a lot for the large scale mines to really assume this responsibility in terms of having the most taking care of their workers and of the communities that are related to them. And this is the challenge that we have for this year. And actually, I think this new normality is going to probably have to be also taking us for the coming year 2021 as well. For the future, we still have our projects that we are looking for. We have 48 projects for the next 8 years, amounting around $57,000 million, which we expect to complete in favor of our nation. And as well, we have still 64 exploration projects, among which we have one that is related to lithium in the southern part of Peru. Actually, there is still some more exploration that is being done by the private company that runs this operation. This operation is a deposit that is close to another deposit that got uranium. That's why we were working with the cooperation of the U.S. government and the Canadian government on having certain legislation for the uranium part of the project, in general for the uranium exploration and exploitation. Actually, in the middle of this pandemic, we were working on this, and we look forward to keep moving on this and try to finalize these regulations, particular regulations for by the end of this year. And with this, hopefully we have this project ready for the private sector to keep looking for their financing part and hopefully start the development of this project in the future. Actually, in the close future, we expect so. And with this, I just wanna here stop. I think I've been trying to do a whole picture of what we're doing now and what the stage we are, what we are facing now with this COVID situation with the mining sector. Of course, we are still in the process of keep working more on our governance for the mining sector and to make it more sustainable, not only from the environmental point of view and the financial point of view, but also from the social part, which is actually the challenge that we were facing before the COVID, and we believe we are gonna have to keep working more, and initiatives like ERGI that we are also supporting, we believe can help on this future. Thank you with this, and I'm ready for any question and answers that you may have.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister Cauti. Given we're a bit over for time already, I want to get right into the conversation. I'd like to remind all of our panelists to unmute when they respond, and please try and keep your response to just a couple minutes. Mr. Tupper, let's start with you. As Dr. Bazilian highlighted, we know that a clean energy future is going to be quite mineral intensive. If done responsibly, mining can have serious negative environmental and social impacts on the immediate region. In your position as Associate Deputy Minister, what do you think are some of the most impactful actions a ministry or government agency can take to ensure social responsibility throughout a mining project?
I think we've mentioned quite a few of them already. I think clear standards, understanding best practices, kind of doing the public education, working with industry to make sure that there is a common understanding of what those standards and best practices are. The commitment to multilateralism. I think that our collective work, ERGI is just it's another forum for us where we can engage with partners to make sure that there's a clear global message in terms of the importance of ESG and corporate responsibility. In Canada, we've had in place for some time a framework for corporate responsibility and an ombudsman. We've put in place a new regulatory regime that speaks to the balance of not just our environmental protections, but how we'll work with Indigenous people, how we'll work with corporations to make sure that as projects get approved to move forward, that they're kind of spanning that full frame of responsibility and activity. My final comment would be with respect to science. CanMet Labs leading initiatives is bringing forward global science with respect to extracting value from waste and trying to understand how we can clean up some of the byproducts and waste that occurs through not just mining, but oil and gas and other activities. The contribution that governments can make to ensure that we're doing this based on good science and whatnot are critical factors.
Thank you so much. Tyler, this next one is for you. Some countries are enacting policies with the goal of increasing downstream value in the clean tech value chain. Indonesia's nickel ore export ban and their announcement to produce EV batteries is a great example of this. Do you feel this strengthens or weakens supply chains?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think it's a straightforward answer. And well, look, we should say that mineral producing countries have been seeking to increase their value-added share for a long time. This is nothing new. Bans on export ores is something that's actually quite common, and there's a cyclical element to this. Obviously, countries should be seeking to attract investment in skills and know-how to further integrate segments of the value chain into their jurisdictions. That's going to be better for their own development and their own criticality and dependency. Instead of having to export ores and buy back in complex products containing those ores where most of the value is on that downstream side. So I think yes, and also I think some of the charts that the opening speaker, Dr. Bazilian mentioned is that midstream being dominated by a few countries. The more that can be diversified, the better. And if countries are able to shorten their own domestic supply chains, that also makes things like checking for responsible sourcing much easier because you have fewer stages and segments of the supply chain to sort of peel back. But I also think it's not something that countries can just shoehorn through legislation. And I think that's the kind of critical part. I mean, you've seen in Africa a lot of requirements on export, but if the power generation is not there to actually smelt and refine those products, and if the logistics and services aren't there, and there's not a predictable business environment, it's very difficult to force investors into those higher value added activities, and if the skills aren't there. So it's a complex issue. I think it goes in the right direction, particularly if we're looking for development and diversity. But I think it's more than policy or legislation is needed to make that a reality.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And Vice Minister Kelsey, this next one's for you. Many countries who are new to the mining sector are discovering deposits of energy minerals in their borders. As an experienced country in this regard, what first steps should a quote-unquote new mining economy take as they start to target energy mineral production? Just a reminder, you may be on mute.
Excuse me, Gina. I just could not hear you completely the question. Please,
I'm happy to repeat it.
Yes.
Many countries who are new to the mining sector.
Excuse me. There is like a sound in the back or something. That.
Could I remind everyone else to please mute?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, let's try this again. Many countries who are new to the mining sector are discovering deposits of energy minerals in their borders. As an experienced country in this regard, what first steps should a quote-unquote new mining economy take as they start to target energy mineral production?
Oh wow, yeah, that's a quite hard country to make recommendations from another. In 2 minutes. Well, actually, let's say. Well, it will depend. It will depend on each country. I think the particular situations of each country in terms of what they face, the challenges that they may have from a different point of view, regulatory, social issues, environmental aspects, technological advance, value-added chain. I think it's hard to make just a single recommendation. No, in our case, no, in the case of Peru, of course, we have implemented since the beginning for having the mining sector to be what it overcomes in the last 20-25 years. I think it was the beginning regulation that we really make it clear for our, in general, the private sector. The mining sector in Peru is basically run by private sector. We don't have public companies running any of the mining operations. So at the beginning it has to be very clear on what regulations we have, what legislation we have in order to attract these companies, and that they feel that the legal system is stable, and we have accomplished this at the, I would say, this 20-25 years. And that's why we have the growing of the economy of the country as a general topic. And of course, then I think the supporting of these initiatives like the value chain that we were talking since early this morning, that is being dealt by the previous panelists. I think that's also part of the initiatives that we are also supporting, as I was explaining before. Know what we are working, the development of this technological route or roadmap with the mining suppliers. And also that we are working with the mining cluster in the southern part of Peru in order to try to have an impact on the GDP of the country that double what the mining sector provides to the country. That's our goal now, our plan, and of course the social. The development, the territorial aspect of the development of the mining projects. Now that this is an actual challenge that we have in Peru for in the last project that we've been developing. In the future still, no, it's going to be really a major issue that we all have to face, the private sector, the public government, in order to support this relationship between the mining project investors projects in their relationship with the population in the area where the project is being developed. I think this is part of the main issues that we've been facing in the last years, and it's gonna be part of the coming projects. And I think this is what we are working in these different initiatives. Actually, also the vision that was developed by a Peruvian group named RIMAI, which was with the participation of the private social civil society, the public sector, was accomplished last year. And this was a first stage on trying to make a national, let's say, a national vision of the mining sector for the future. And this is part of the ideas, initiatives that we are keep working on this. We haven't really accomplished all. So I would say that initiatives as RG will also contribute on this. No, so this is basically of this trying to make a nutshell in 2 minutes of certain different topics for this type of new projects, and we expect to keep going on this, no, and keep moving, and of course taking the lessons from other countries. I think forums like this one contribute to exchange ideas and to exchange lessons and practices, good practices that we all need in order to the mining sector to keep providing and keep contributing to our countries.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful response, and to Associate Deputy Minister Tupper, Vice Minister Kauti, and Mr. Gillard. What an amazing group of people from 3 different continents dedicated to kind of having this conversation and exploring these issues. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. With that, we're a little over, so I'm going to turn it back over to Mark. Mark, back to you. Thank you so much.
Jenna, thank you so much for moderating that panel, and thank you very much to all of our panelists for such a vibrant discussion. In the interest of time, we'll immediately convene our second panel, which will be on stewardship. I'd like to introduce our next moderator from the International Renewable Energy Agency, Dolph Galen, who is the Innovation Director at IRENA. Dolph, thank you so much for moderating this panel, and I'll let you take it away at this time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. We'll immediately dive in. We have about 40 minutes left for this panel. So we'll hear from our 3 distinguished speakers that I will introduce when they speak in a moment. Then we'll have a Q&A session, and I'd also encourage you in the audience to ask questions. You can use the chat feature on the panel, and I saw in the other panel already you found that. There were also questions about the recording, so these will be available. They will be posted on the IRENA website in a few days. So as we heard, the energy transition is going to be very mineral intensive. We need these materials to make this transition happen. And for that, we need scaling up of the minerals mining in line with the forecast that we heard from minerals needs. And we need these minerals at an acceptable price, but of course also in a sustainable and socially acceptable way of production. Now, broadening supply is one way to deal with that challenge, but there are also other strategies that can contribute. And there are 2 of them we want to highlight a bit further in this session also. One is around the issue of recycling and reuse. So what can be the role of the circular economy to make this happen? And second, would there also be strategies to reduce the demand for these minerals through different types of equipment and product designs? And are there maybe substitution opportunities for these minerals? This is a hot topic. For example, yesterday there was news that a new car battery recycling factory will be built in Sweden. And in many countries, also in the United States, of course, this is on the agenda. We want to hear a bit about emerging best practice in countries, national approaches to foster recycling and reuse, and ways to reduce these materials use. So with that, I would like to move to our first speaker, that is Christopher Sheldon. He is the practice manager for extractives of the World Bank. So the World Bank has been active in this field since a couple of years. You're probably familiar with the Climate Smart Mining facility and the growing role of minerals and metals for low carbon future reports, which illustrated the rapid growth. But a few weeks ago, there was a new report called Minerals for Climate Action, the Mineral Intensity of the Clean Energy Transition. And that report also looks into recycling and reuse. So with that, Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dolph. I hope you can all hear me okay. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I'd like to express my thanks to Assistant Secretary Fannon and to IRENA for the invitation. You can go to the next slide, please. As has been mentioned, we've been looking at this for a number of years now, and that first report that came out a few years ago was really one of the first times many people started to think about the mineral intensity of the clean energy revolution. So this updated report looks much more at the demand risk, also dives a little bit deeper in some of the technological improvements and the material efficiency. We look at recycling reuse, and I'll cover that a little bit more. And then also the carbon footprint of minerals needed for low carbon technologies. Next slide, please. So these are estimates based upon existing scenarios. So we take the IEA model in particular, and then we extrapolate along existing technologies in wind, solar, and battery storage. But you can see it's just a massive increase in the amount of minerals that are needed. 3 billion tons of minerals and metals would be needed by 2050 to achieve a 2 degrees or less scenario. That's equivalent to more than a third of all plastics produced between 1950 and 2015. So just a massive increase in minerals. Next slide, please. For certain minerals, it's increase of around 500% in order to achieve that. For other minerals, it's a lower percentage, but nevertheless, even aluminium and copper, the volumes of increased mineral consumption are expected to be huge. Now, this is based on existing technologies, so technologies could change, the mineral composition of certain technologies could change, the scenarios could change, but no matter how we look at it, the mineral intensity of the future, the energy future, will be much, much more than the mineral intensity of the past. So we're going to need minerals. So that then begs the question of, well, what about recycling reuse? So next slide, please. So we looked at the current end-of-life recycling rates, and here I've just listed a few of the commodities: aluminium, cobalt, copper, lithium, and nickel. And then we actually assumed, well, what if that got to 100% by 2050? What would then happen? And we'll show that in the next slide. But it's very clear that recycling is not completely the answer to new mineral demand. Next slide, please. So here we've just picked aluminium and cobalt, and there's more examples in the report. But the recycling rates refer to how many minerals are currently recycled at the product's end of life, and the recycled content is the secondary minerals. In other words, the amount of recycled material that's actually in new products. So even if we assume that we got to 100% for aluminium and copper, for example, it still wouldn't be enough to meet the demand for those minerals under a 2 degrees scenario. You can see, cobalt there, and we talked about cobalt as well. it's just not going to be enough. Primary cobalt demand will still be needed, even if you've got an increased secondary amount of cobalt available. So whilst recycling can play an important role in meeting demand, primary production is still going to be needed. We are coming out in a couple of weeks, actually, with a more in-depth report on battery recycling, because a lot of this is, of course, driven by the growth in batteries for electric cars and for storage. And there's a number of challenges that we're facing in regard to battery storage. There's technological barriers, there's economic barriers, logistic issues, there's regulatory problems when it comes to reuse and recycling. But we're having to look at not just recycling, but also reuse. So particularly when it comes to the electric vehicle market, lithium-ion battery, which is expected to grow at near exponential rates, they're looking at repurposing of lithium-ion batteries, and considerable research is going into that to convert electric vehicle batteries at the end of their life into power pack or battery backup. But no matter how we look at it, whether you're incorporating reuse, recycling practices, it's not a question of recycling versus mining. Both are going to be necessary in order to feed the global clean energy revolution. So,
Christopher, I don't want to interrupt you, but you should be aware that apparently many people cannot see your slides. So,
they can't see the slides? I'm not in control of the slides. Sorry, it's coming through from the team. Can you see them now? Sorry, I'll just continue. I was just about to conclude. Sorry, they hadn't come through. So I'll just end by saying, even with recycling reuse, we're still going to need mining. And so the way that mining is done, the carbon intensity of mining practices are also of great importance as we ensure that we have enough minerals for the clean energy future.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And I'm sorry for this glitch. We will make the slides available also to the participants after the meeting. So they
Sure, no problem. Thank you.
With that, I would like to move to the second panelist, which is Peter Handley, who is the head of Energy Intensive Industries and Raw Materials from the Directorate General GROW of the European Commission. So the dependencies is an important topic in Europe. The Commission was one of the first administrations to create a list of critical minerals already back in 2011. Morgan Bazilian also mentioned that, and it has been updated a couple of times since. So what are now the insights from that effort on what can be the role of circular economy and the technical and economic feasibility of recycling, reuse, and possibilities for mineral substitution and engagement of the supply chain in these strategies. So that will be the topic, and as well there have been many insights from the RD&D program under Horizon 2020, which the Commission has funded, and also some of that. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Peter for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Dolf, and thank you, Christopher. I agree with everything you've just said. Could you please use the first slide? Next slide, please. So this is a slide, the criticality assessment we did in 2017, which shows where Europe gets its critical raw materials from. And you can see that in many cases, we are import dependent for 50% or more of the materials that we need in our economy. China is the source of a fair number of materials from China. Next slide, please.
Peter, let me tell you that, again, the audience cannot see your slide. I see them, but apparently the audience not. So assume that they cannot see it. Try to talk without slide.
All right, I will. then there is a slide which shows the 27 critical raw materials on the 2017 list. And the interesting point to note on this is that approximately half of them are used in different energy applications, whether it be for renewables or for hydro or for hydrogen fuel cells or for solar panels. For us, the criticality is not just, I've heard the term energy materials and energy minerals. For us, it's really a whole economy issue. The next slide, for those who can see it, is very much aligned on what Christopher was saying. We forecast a massive increase in demand for raw materials by mid-century, and we see our strategy for addressing this as being partly doing a lot more circular economy throughout the value chain, starting with much more resiliency in the extractive and process sectors, replacing fossil fuels by renewables in those sectors, designing much more circularity and recoverability in the life cycle product, and enhance the recycling and waste collection. So the very last slide I have is just showing you 2 or 3 recent reports that we have produced recently from our joint research center. One is looking at substitution, and another is looking at the different energy-related sectors and what they need in terms of dependencies on critical raw materials. Now, I move from the slides. What I want to say is that Europe's position is basically driven by what we call the European Green Deal, and we've set out our goal to become climate neutral and circular by 2050. In our Green Deal strategy, we describe this as our new economic growth strategy because we think it's necessary to seize the Paris Agreement objectives as the driver for an opportunity for transforming the whole economy. Our Green Deal recognizes that access to resources, such as critical raw materials, is going to be a security question, a global geopolitical question. And we see that we need both much more recovery, keeping things in the economy from cycling, but also we need a lot of primary materials so that we improve the sustainability of those raw materials. So we're going to be doing a lot more diversification, both in terms of the sourcing from third countries and looking a lot more closely at what we can do with the critical raw materials we have in Europe itself. You may have seen the work we've been doing on the batteries initiative in the last couple of years, and here we're putting together industrial consortia which put together the raw materials we have in Europe, particularly lithium at the moment, but not exclusively, with processing of those materials, production of battery cells, use, and then the recycling. We have a lot of investment going into this area at the moment, and we are going to be developing a regulatory framework for batteries, which we'll come forward with in the autumn of this year. In terms of our circular economy approach, we're doing a lot of work on substitution. Over the past 10, 15 years, for example, the amount of platinum group metals that go into fuel cells has been cut back by 80% because the platinum is basically representing the cost of the fuel cells. So it's clearly an area where making greater use of just last week, the Commission came forward with its recovery plan. And what's interesting there is that the key words that come out of this recovery plan are the need to become much more aware of vulnerability in global markets and to develop much more strategic autonomy and resilience. And this recovery plan identifies critical raw materials that are going into e-mobility, into renewables, into defense, and digital applications as being one of those areas which would need to benefit from the new strategic investment facility to develop more European or reliable third country sourcing of critical minerals in the coming few years. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And the slides seem to work now. At least they've seen your last slide. So as said, we will also send these around. Now I would like to move to our third panelist. It's Dr. Jeff Spangenberger, who is the director of the ReCell Center at Argonne National Lab. So in the US, the supply considerations also consider the aspects of alternative substitutes and recycling. DOE announced this year an $18 million program for research into rare earth metals substitution. And at the beginning of the year, the ReCell Center, which was launched, which is looking at strategies to improve recycling for lithium-ion batteries, which is, of course, a very important aspect in this transition. So, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll try and keep this brief, and I'll assume that everybody can see the slides. I'm the Materials Recovery and Recycling Program Lead at Argonne National Laboratory, and I am also the Director of the Battery Recycling Program called ReCell, which is funded by the Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office. I want to start by taking a bit, and this is going to get a little technical. I hope that this is helpful, but I want to start by talking a bit about lithium-ion batteries to help the understanding of what lithium-ion battery recycling is all about. The graphic in the upper right is a visual reference that you can use, and hopefully all of you can see that. But first, I want to make clear that rechargeable lithium-ion batteries don't contain the reactive metal lithium. The term lithium-ion refers to the moving of lithium ions back and forth between an anode and a cathode. These are basically the positive and negative sides of a battery. When you charge the battery, electricity pushes the lithium ions to the anode side of the battery, but they don't like it there. And so when you turn your laptop or your phone on, they're allowed to go back to the cathode side, and in doing so, push electricity through your phone. The graphic on the lower right shows how the anode and cathode are layered and then wound into a cylinder to form the battery. The layers can also be stacked and sealed in a pouch as they do in a cell phone, or actually more applications than not. Not all lithium-ion batteries are the same. There are different chemistries for different applications, such as iPhones, laptops, power tools, electric vehicles, and grid storage. Cell phones and laptops use chemistries with high cobalt content, which is expensive, while cordless tools often use a chemistry without any cobalt at all. Meanwhile, electric vehicles use some in between. Each of the different battery types have their particular recycling challenges. For example, cell phones, the batteries in cell phones are worth money, but their collection rates are extremely low. Additionally, more and more of these batteries are becoming integrated within the device and cannot easily be removed. Meanwhile, electric vehicle batteries are expected to have high collection rates, but because they have lower value battery chemistries and the need to disassemble or dismantle before recycling, they actually cost money to recycle. Next slide, please. All right, I'll move on. That leads us to ReCell. ReCell is actually, in particular, is a $15 million program over 3 years that is focused on making vehicle battery recycling more economically attractive. The $18 million number that was just given is actually inclusive of the battery recycling prize, which is more dealing with the logistics of collection of these batteries. Excuse me. The program is led by Argonne National Laboratory, but includes also the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, as well as 3 universities. There are current technologies that I want to make clear, current technologies that exist today that allow for recycling lithium-ion batteries. Pyrometallurgical-based processes use high temperatures to burn off the organic components, utilizing that energy, of course. Thank you. And produce a slag. Unfortunately, the slag contains the lithium and the aluminum metals, which are then more costly to recover once they're trapped in the slag. The main product is a metal alloy containing cobalt, nickel, copper, and other valuable metals, though. And this alloy then goes further through further processing to separate the metals for reuse. Another technology used today for lithium-ion battery recycling is hydrometallurgical processing. Here, the batteries are put into acid, and that dissolves the metals, while the non-soluble materials are filtered out. The metals in solution are then individually separated out into metals or metal salts. Both process types have their advantages and are able to close the loop by providing materials that will go back into batteries. However, these technologies are not terribly cost-effective because of the output products being generally low-value raw materials. Both of these processes are fairly mature, so improvements made on them are expected to be incremental. And it is expected that as more and more batteries come back, the economy of scale will improve the economics, but it's unclear just how much. ReCell is spending much of its efforts on the investigation of a newer recycling method called direct cathode recycling. Direct recycling does not break down the crystal structure of the cathode material, and so we're working to recover, purify, and rejuvenate the cathode material as it's found in the battery. Doing this provides the opportunity to recover the value of the cathode material instead of the raw material feeds that go into the battery. And this enables the opportunity to realize a more economically attractive process. Aside from working on direct cathode recycling, we're also looking into ways we can recover other materials from batteries, such as electrolyte components, anode materials, and plastics. Any other materials we can economically recover will help to improve the overall economics. Another area we focus on is design for recycle. Here, we're trying to find ways to make recycling batteries in the future easier and more cost-effective. Another thing we do is look at battery designs that will enable extended lifetimes so that battery replacements are less frequent, requiring the use of less overall materials. And lastly, we use modeling to help us make sure that the work we're doing actually makes sense. And also the work that we've done is turning out the way that we had planned. Our models include Everbat, which is a tool that compares costs and environmental impacts of the processes throughout a battery's lifetime, as well as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's systems dynamic model called Libra. The ReCell Center hopes to provide a place that brings together battery recycling expertise and bridge the gaps between them to efficiently address the many challenges that face a successful advanced battery recycling infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for these opening remarks. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to jump immediately into the questions. Christopher, when you started, you compared a scenario with very high recycling rates, and I think your conclusion there was that it doesn't really make such a big difference for the outcome. You still need a lot of primary materials. So how can we make clean energy technology supply chains greener? And is that interpretation correct?
It does make a difference, certainly, in that you would need less mined material. I'm sorry that people couldn't see the slides, but basically what we were saying there is even if we get the recycling of the end-of-life recycling of a product up to 100%, because there's such an increase in demand for those same minerals, it won't be enough that you could only use recycled material in order to build all the things that we need. So that doesn't mean you don't work on recycling and reuse. Of course, you definitely do that. But based on what we see for the demand for those minerals, you're still going to need mining. So that means then the climate smart mining, is also concerned about how we mine, the energy intensity, the carbon intensity of mining production, the waste that is generated, the use of water, the impact on forest from mining, and not just the mining process, but also the transport of those minerals. So we do think that there's important discussions and actions that governments can take in terms of regulation, but also private companies can make in terms of the innovation and their practices in order to really improve the way mining is done from a climate intensity point of view. And through doing that, we can ensure not only that the minerals are there for these clean technologies, but they're mined, processed, transported in such a way that minimizes the negative impacts of production.
Thank you very much for the clarification. And maybe you can also move then to Jeff first before we to Peter, because you also talked about the recycling of the batteries. And what is your assessment? How much can the recovery of materials through recycling make a difference?
Yeah, good question. So it really depends on the growth rate of batteries, the demand of batteries. If we have a very accelerated growth rate, it doesn't make as much of an impact. There's also a lag. One of the things I didn't mention is if we're talking vehicle batteries, which are presumably going to be the largest fraction of batteries that come back for treatment, a vehicle lasts 15 years. And so the numbers that I go by roughly are if we are to start to recover those materials, it's not going to be until about 2035 that we're really going to start realizing the impact of the recycling, the recovery of these materials. Second use actually pushes this off because if you're delaying the recovery of these materials, then it makes this lag even longer. So there is actually, though, after this time frame of 2035, a very significant change in the requirements, of course, depending on the yields and the recovery rates. But there is a dramatic difference in the amount of primary materials required if we do use these secondary resources.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Peter, there is at the moment a lot of discussion in Europe about stimulus packages. Is this dimension of critical minerals and their supply something which is also discussed in that context?
I'm going to have stuff.
Okay, so let me repeat my question. So I said that in Europe at the moment there's a lot of discussion about the stimulus packages, and in the context of these stimulus packages, is critical raw material supply also discussed, and what kind of discussions are taking place?
Yeah, it's very difficult to hear what you were saying. First of all, I think I would say, to add on to what Jeff was saying, that when it comes to battery recycling, it's a time lag issue, because the big increase in the number of electric vehicles is still to come. And to make that happen, we're going to be relying in the first instance on primary materials for batteries. It's only some years down the road we're going to have enough turnover of the stock to be able to recover and to increase the batteries that use secondary raw materials. But that's definitely the direction we wish to go in, and we support the initiatives that Northvolt and others are taking in that direction at the moment. In trying to guess what you were asking, I would say that we're very focused on critical raw materials in Europe at the moment. I've mentioned the increased focus on resilience and strategic autonomy. We are going to come out very soon with a new updated list of critical raw materials for Europe, and we're going to come out with an action plan. So like America's got an action plan, and Canada's got an action plan, we also will have an action plan which is going to address what we call the resource security challenge, which we see as a combination of the risk related to security of supply and the risks related to unsustainable use of of raw materials.
Thank you very much for that clarification. So recycling can contribute something, but it's limited as we ramp up the stocks. Then what about the substitution effect? Peter, you mentioned, of course, fuel cells, where the load of precious metals has gone down significantly. But the other category where we see a lot of these strategic materials being used is motors and generators. And that's where all the rare earths come in. But in fact, the efficiency gain you get from using all these rare earths is not that significant. We talk a percentage point or 2 percentage points. So I also thinking of strategies where there's a trade-off between the two. Maybe use less of these materials and then lower efficiency.
We've been doing in running a 600 million euro research and innovation program on raw materials, which is looking at a variety of things. But one of the areas we're looking at is how to use less of critical raw materials and how to replace them and get the same functionality. I gave the example of fuel cells, but there's also the example of wind turbines, where quite a lot of work has been done to develop wind turbines that don't need to use any rare earths at all. But for the time being, in the e-mobility sector, we see that the effort we're putting into developing batteries needs to be accompanied by an effort to make sure that we are able to produce the electric motors and produce the magnets that go into those motors, because this is an area where we are very, very much reliant today, as I think most parts of the world are, on Chinese mastery of the whole value chain leading up to the production of the magnets, but also all the different phases of producing the rare earths. So I think for the time being, rare earths, we'll still need them because they have certain functionalities which is quite difficult to replace. But I fully agree with you. We need to pursue the possibilities to reduce our dependence on the rare earths.
Thank you very much for that. Christopher, a question for you. And a question also from the audience. They said, well, lax environmental and social standards in providing these strategic materials can be seen also as a competitive advantage. So how do we ensure a level playing field in this? And is it critical in your view?
I think it's absolutely critical, and that's a great question. And I think Assistant Secretary Fannon sort of raised that right at the beginning, and the last panel talking about governance raised that. There is an increase in expectations from consumers about the way that things are mined and the products that people use. There's an increase in government regulation to ensure that materials are responsibly mined. So I think we'll increasingly see pressure both from host governments and also from consumers to be more focused on that, and we'll see standards increase. So in that sense, actually, it becomes a disadvantage to how you mine. And if what I also said earlier about the carbon intensity production is true, that will also make a difference in copper from one place being more attractive than copper from another if it's mined in a more socially responsible way or with less carbon intensity, perhaps because they're using hydroelectricity instead of diesel or heavy fuel oil, and the same for aluminium. And just one comment on your last point there too, about substitution. I mean, we did some analysis in the report that showed that some minerals are used across all technologies. Some are used just in a few. So in many cases, regardless of what technology you pick, you're still going to need certain minerals across all of them. Copper, aluminium, for example, are just so widespread. and we're going to need them in less percentage increase terms than things like cobalt, lithium, graphite, etc., that are going primarily into batteries. But in volumes, there's still a significant increase. But I don't believe in this view of sort of a race to the bottom that's going to work. I think the world is changing, and the expectations of governments, consumers is changing with that, and will partially force change. But I think also the market will be demanding some kind of a change in the way mining is done.
Thank you very much. And a last question for you, Jeff. You talked about the technology of recycling, but you also pointed out that, for example, for the telephones, recycling is very difficult. So, and increasingly so. Do you see a role for the consumer in getting to higher recycling rates? We cannot hear you.
Sorry. For consumer electronics, it really helps to have the public aware of what they need to do to safely recycle their batteries and their electronics, for that matter. There are a lot of programs available that people aren't really aware of. If you go to a retail store, there's commonly places to drop your batteries off. What you really want to make sure that you don't do is throw them in the garbage or put them in your recycling bin, your curbside recycling, because this is actually more of a problem. They call it wish recycling. You put it in a recycling bin and they'll figure it out down the road. But what that does is it puts the battery through equipment that is not made for batteries. They can crush the batteries, they can cut the batteries, and it actually is starting fires in a lot of these other recycling facilities. So really you want to make sure that, and people should be aware that there are places to bring your battery containing devices or batteries themselves, and that can greatly increase the quantity of materials coming back.
So also a role for all of us as consumers. I find this a fascinating discussion, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I have to close this panel. I thank all the panelists for their inputs. Again, apologies to the audience that they couldn't see all the slides. We'll make them available so you can kind of look at them later. And with that, I hand back to Mark.
Thank you so much, Dolph, for that wonderful discussion. That was quite impressive in both its depth and its breadth. I do have to agree with you that I wish that the discussion could keep going, but we do have to be mindful of our audience's time. So with that, I will not delay any longer, and I will now turn it over to Assistant Secretary Fannon, who will deliver the closing remarks on behalf of the State Department for this event. Assistant Secretary Fannon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you for all of our distinguished panelists, participants, and our robust global audience. I'd also especially like to thank Francesco and IRENA. This event has underpinned both how important minerals will be to energy and how incredibly important it will be to extract and process them responsibly. This is really going to take passionate people working very hard, making sure that supply chains are secure, that human rights are respected throughout the supply chain, and that the deals made benefit everyone, including local communities. This was made abundantly clear by the governance panelists, who highlighted both the role of government organizations, government partnerships, as well as multilateral organizations such as ERGI or ERGI and the OECD in addressing risk and corruption in the extractive sector. We also heard from the governments of Peru and Canada how much responsible mining can positively impact a country's quality of life. Our colleagues noted that this is especially true when mining companies prioritize the lives of those near a mine or implied by a mine. Social license to operate is really foundational to moving forward. We also heard about the cutting edge technologies and innovation being applied all across the clean energy value chain. These innovations, including policy, create an opportunity to increase our access to critical minerals and improve our stewardship. After listening listening in on the stewardship panel, it's clear to me that we will see an increased focus on greater diversity of supply and more robust supply chains in addition to recycling. Underpinning all of this must be greater investment in the mineral sector. That's where initiatives like ERGI play a critical role, as they will help build the right investment conditions for minerals around the world. As we recover from the pandemic, these principles of stewardship and responsibility must be what drive policy and investment. I'm excited to see what the future brings, and I'm confident that if we build on conversations like this one and transition from discussion to implementation to action, that we can realize a true, responsible, clean energy industry. With that, I'd like to say thank you again to DG La Camera and IRENA. I'd also like to thank Dr. Bazilian and our terrific panelists. Thank you to the audience. I hope you take care, be well, and remain committed to the cause. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Fannon, for those words. Really appreciate that. I will now go ahead and turn it over to Dolph Gillard again of the International Renewable Energy Agency for closing remarks from IRENA. Dolph, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Assistant Secretary Fannon and Department of State. I think this was an excellent start to an deepened cooperation on this topic. I think we've clearly made the point that this is important as a strategic topic by itself, but also as a key part of energy transition. And we look forward to work further with you, but with all participants in this panel in bringing this topic forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dolph. And with that, that concludes our event. On behalf of the State Department, I would like to thank all of our speakers, panelists, and to you, the audience, who
to say something
from all over the world. I want to thank you very much for all of your participation. And I'm sorry, somebody who is attempting to say something? Okay, sounds like we were having some technical difficulties there. So,
Mark, Francesco just came in. Francesco now muted.
Can you hear me?
Do you want final remarks, please, Mark?
Absolutely.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Just please tell me how nice to finally see Francis in video. Unfortunately, we cannot be around the good table for having something for eating and drinking. That's
soon enough.
Must be very soon. Must be very soon. And I have to say, to admit, you were right. And thanks for suggesting to bring this argument and having this discussion. I think it was very timely. This will be absolutely informing the meeting on geopolitics. I will not prejudice what will be the outputs of that meeting, but I think that may come also the invite to have IRENA more involved and working more on the technical aspects, because I think they are very, 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 very relevant. So thank you again for having the chance working together, and we have to strengthen our collaboration in the future and enjoying also our friendship. Thank you very much to all the participants, and thanks. I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for cutting the camera, and my apologies for cutting you off. I'm very happy that you got an opportunity to provide some concluding remarks as well. So once again, I'd like to thank our audience. Thank you very much to all the panelists and speakers, and with that, we will conclude this event. I do want to just make one note clear that this event was recorded and it will be available through IRENA. So anybody who was unable to view the entire event will be able to see the recording after that is posted. We will endeavor to do so as quickly as possible. Thanks once again. Have a great day.